emotional eating and cravings can be something that maybe just happens when you're stressed or when you're a little bit down. Until you get somewhere to that level where you make yourself your most important person and you develop some sort of self-love, it's very difficult to get over this. I don't like the fake you till you make it part, but what I like is to visualize yourself in the future and act as if you were already in the future. Often people try saying, okay, now I cut out the sugar and instead of my normal Coca-Cola or soda, sugary soda, I use artificially sweetened soda, which actually is worse, if there's such a thing as worse.
Okay, welcome and good morning. We have with us Andrea Caprio. I believe I'm hopefully saying that correctly. Andrea, where are you located right now? I know you're German originally, but where are you located currently?
That's a good question. At the moment, I'm located actually in Italy, beautiful, directly on the coast. I was living in Miami before, and we lived in South Africa and Portugal and many other countries. So it has been quite a journey, my life, and we're in Italy now.
That's beautiful. That's interesting. I've been all the places you've described. They're all pretty. Where in South Africa were you? What brought you down there?
Yeah, I was in Johannesburg and in Cape Town. I lived about 16 years actually in South Africa. I think the longest everywhere, except Germany maybe. It brought me there. We were before that in Kenya, and then from Kenya, my meanwhile ex-husband got a job in South Africa, and so we moved there. And I just stayed on. I got divorced, found my new husband, and I loved it there, I must say. It's really interesting.
So Cape Town particularly is beautiful. My mother was actually South African, and so I went there many, many times as a child. And then the last time I was there was in 91 or something like that, so many years ago. I may go this year. They want me to come back and do some lecturing there, so I might get a chance to go back.
Lots of changes.
Yeah, interesting. They've got a lot. They like meat down in South Africa too, which is really nice.
True, very true. You have the braai there.
Yeah, the braais and the biltong and all that stuff. Yeah, very good stuff. Let's get into your background, because you are involved with, I guess, why we eat, perhaps. I saw something about emotional eating and things of that nature. Maybe you just give us a little bit more of your background. What drove you in that direction to be interested in that in the first place?
So I started to have issues myself, health issues, right? I was always tired. I was always having some gut issues, and I had hormonal issues, migraines, etc., etc. And I came across a different way of eating, because I realized actually that I have been eating far too much sugar, right? There was a bit sugar in my coffee. There was sugar in the cookies I had and the granola I had and so on. And I realized there was far too much. I call it crap food. There's a lot of processed food, sugar and so on. And when I changed my diet and I started to eat clean food, I literally improved all my health markers, right? Everything reversed. I felt really great. I had great energy, no more fatigue, no more migraine headaches. I have now, instead of weekly, I have it maybe 3-4 times a year or so. So I really turned my health around. And that's when I started, like it is, Facebook shows you an ad, and I saw a nutrition school. And then I did a research on really looking for the right nutrition school that provides a more holistic approach that I felt was right. And I started working. That was over 7 years now in Miami. That at the time I lived in Miami, and I help people to achieve the same, because I realized living there how many, obviously in the American market, how many people there were struggling with weight issues, with emotional eating issues, and as a result were really not eating well for their health. And I started helping them, and that was the start of Wellness Methods, my company, and really went from there.
Let me ask you, you're obviously you're in Miami now, in Italy, and whenever I go to Europe, I notice a general decrease in the amount of prevalence of obesity that's going on. The food culture is a little bit different. People tend to, a lot of walking occurs in and around meals, I seem to see, depending on where you are. But do you notice the same issues in Italy, or are you dealing with folks in Italy as much as you are in the U.S. still?
So I don't deal with people in Europe. Like in Italy, I don't work in Italy with Italians here. I just decided I want to keep my business online because moving around so much has served me better to be online. But I see, of course, the people, and it's a huge difference, right? And like you said, first of all, it's funny when people say, "Hey, what are you doing?" And I say, "Oh, I'm an emotional eating coach." And they look at me, an emotional eating coach. They can literally not understand, most people here, that there is such a thing as emotional eating, stress eating, emotional eating. People here in Italy and many people in Europe, not exclusively, but they just enjoy food. To enjoy food, just to eat and be nourished with good food, good healthy food, and enjoy the act of eating as such, not to replace a missing purpose, not to overcome stress or whatever it is that happens so often in America and other countries too. But I have noticed in America, there's really a huge issue around that.
No, I guess maybe we should further define, because emotions, and there are a lot of emotions, happiness, sadness, depression, there's all kinds of things. And I'm happy to eat. I'm usually happy when I eat because I'm enjoying what I'm eating. That maybe is not necessarily a sort of problem in some regards. But what is, I guess maybe talk a little more in detail, what is emotional eating? What are the origins of it for a particular individual? That might be instructive.
So emotional eating, I always see it that there are several levels. So you have food addiction that can be emotional eating, but is usually on a certain spectrum. Whereas emotional eating and cravings can be something that maybe just happens when you're stressed or when you're a little bit down. So you have to see always where are you at that spectrum. And obviously that's a bit difficult now to say for everybody, but I think that's very important to distinguish here. And like you said, is some people eat for happiness, some for sadness. I personally think emotional eating is something when you try to fulfill a spiritual or an emotional hunger with food. So for example, if you have a missing purpose in life, let's say you have children are gone out of the house and you miss the kids and suddenly you start eating to replace the kids, basically, right? Or if you react to your boss calling you at various times of the day and you're super stressed about because maybe it's not the nicest boss or so. And each time that happens, you open the drawer and you eat some cookies. If, for example, you eat not having a physical hunger. So when I work with my clients, I have actually a chart that shows physical hunger and emotional hunger to distinguish between the two. So for example, if you eat to overcome maybe that you're down or that you're sad or you're upset or something, or on the contrary, when you eat a lot when you're together with friends, when you're celebrating, right? These can all be emotional eating or forms of emotional eating. Obviously, there are plenty of others, but that hopefully gives some samples.
Is there a sense of, there are probably some people that actually maybe intentionally eat knowingly bad food in order to self-harm themselves? You see some people that just punish themselves knowingly. Do you run into any of that? Does that actually, I assume that exists.
Of course, like with everything, right? In a way, if you look at food is equal, it's actually, in my opinion, worse because one, it's more accessible and it's more difficult to remove food from the table, if I may say so, pun intended, right? Than, for example, drugs or alcohol or gaming addiction or sexual addiction or whatever it is, right? So it's very difficult. And yes, people self-harm themselves. I see it even more so. And that is something I'm really passionate about. I work with my clients, not just telling them what to eat or not to eat, right? Or providing fancy recipes or whatever it is. But I work a lot at the root cause of their issues, right? That can be physical, but the most of the time I work on the emotional or the spiritual root causes, the psychological root causes, and with that on the mindset. And many people have had we all had past lives, but have been affected by their past lives. It can be trauma, but it can be just something that maybe the parents were a bit negligent because they've been working a lot or so. And out of this, we have formed false beliefs, limiting beliefs. We're not worthy. We're not lovable. We are not good enough to do something or whatever it is. And from there, we then often can replace that feeling of this missing feeling of something with food. Of course, it could be replaced with drugs, alcohol, but we're speaking here about food, obviously. So that is something where then people harm themselves. Often they don't know it. They don't realize it. It's because it's the subconscious, right? And they will go in and binge eat or starve themselves or whatever it is, right? Whatever their way is. And that is then self-harming. And then there's, of course, also self-sabotage, right? Where people know they should be eating a certain type of food, right? They should eat healthy. They should avoid junk food or the cookies or the sweet stuff or whatever it is, but they still continue. And the self-sabotage is then often because we have that limiting mindset that keeps us somewhere stuck in the past.
So one of the things that I've seen is that obviously the psychological aspect drives a lot of the behaviors, but often that's overlaid upon a physiologic setting. And so I find that in my experience, when we get people to normalize their physiology, maybe they come off the sugar roller coaster, then they're better able psychologically to deal with these issues that maybe are deeper down, whatever, if they've had some sort of issues from childhood or some sort of stress that occurs. If the physiology isn't settling, then it's harder. Do you find that as all, or how do you approach this?
Shawn, you're absolutely right there. And there are several stages when I work with my clients. I work with them one-on-one or my group coaching program or even other ways. And what I've found interesting now in these a bit over 7 years practice working with hundreds and hundreds of people of all kind of different levels, different issues and so on, mostly in the emotional eating and weight loss realm, not exclusively, but mostly. Now, what often I find is I've developed a 5-step system. I called it my food freedom formula. I still use it, but I was starting to work on the root cause. Root cause, again, can be some physical issues, emotional issues, and so on. And then I was working on addressing those, really allowing the body to heal, implementing healthy habits, and then work on the mindset. So I found really at the time that often people need most of the work on the mindset, but they're not ready. 80% of my work with people at that level is mindset, right? Once they overcome that, then they're all fine. But to make it easier, I had to start working on other things. So that's why often I work at the root cause. That's often why I work at habits, implementing really, really simple habits, because often people they don't have the willpower at the time. And by the way, I feel willpower is overrated, so I would not recommend that is a thing, but they're pushing the rock up the mountain, right? And it's obviously a big rock and it's very difficult. So by, for example, changing certain type of foods, it's very easy just to regulate the blood sugar. By excluding maybe some foods or changing the way they're eating, or even maybe it can be sometimes supplements, we can rewire the neurotransmitters and the brain with it. And that makes it easier to have less cravings. We can address hormone imbalance very easily in general. So it helps that the satiety and the hunger hormones are a little bit more balanced and so on. But yes, you're absolutely right, Shawn. We can make it easier.
What are some of obviously I'm very familiar with dietary strategies. I do that pretty much all day long. But as far as some of the other tools that you have to utilize to address some of these other sort of, I guess, mindset type of issues, are there exercises or just biofeedback? What kind of things do you utilize
Okay, so there are several levels. So one, I believe in a balanced lifestyle. And what I mean by that, or a healthy lifestyle, and what I mean by that, besides obviously nutrition for me is, I would say, the most important part. But without the other parts, nutrition will not be effective, even if it's the optimal nutrition for somebody. But it's also important to look at exercise, right? So we need a certain amount of exercise, and that depends again on the person. Where are they at? are they able to do exercise or maybe not because they are really obese and they struggle to do exercise? So adapted exercise, and obviously from there develop. Sleep is one of those things that is highly underrated. I think by now a lot of people actually realize how much sleep is important. Sleeping 7 to 9 hours can make it or break it. Again, that affects your hormones. And if your melatonin, which is your sleep hormone, is somehow not working properly, that can definitely have an effect on your satiety and hunger hormones. You also want to look at stress levels, right? So if your adrenals are completely running over, that's really important as well to do maybe some stress management techniques such as breathing exercise or meditation or even journaling. Also want to look at your social interaction. I find that very important. And that's during COVID, for example, during the pandemic, why so many people were struggling. They were one out of their routine, and two, they don't had social interaction, or let's say not the same social interactions as before. And that's why many people went to eat, right? Because that was missing. And obviously that brought up a whole lot of other issues. So that's very important. And then in terms of the mindset, I would say, look, I do a lot of exercises, practices. I have workbooks on my coaching practice. Obviously, I coach people on that in terms of developing a mindset, a different mindset, a more positive mindset. What I really find important is, first of all, the awareness, right? So become aware that you are snacking, if that's the case, or eating emotionally, or overeating, binge eating, or whatever it is. Become aware when that happens. Notice maybe there's a trigger or certain type of triggers, and maybe you can journal on that and realize, oh, it's each time my boss calls, or each time my child cries, or whatever it is. And just by becoming aware, acknowledging it, and then letting go, it's already the first step where you overcome those mindset issues. And then, of course, you can from there work a little bit deeper, and you can do that with maybe a therapist or a coach like me or somebody like you, that really going a little bit deeper. Okay, what is the issue there? What is the reason for that? What is the root cause of that? And then maybe you want to do some trauma work or whatever it is.
Let me ask you your thoughts on, there's this so-called body positivity movement where, so I guess when I see that, I think then maybe these people feel very negative and they need the positivity to lift them out of the negativity they're in. Obviously, many of them are quite a bit overweight. And how do you see that? Is it a net positive that you can feel better and then maybe work on yourself, or is it a false sort of narrative? What are your thoughts on that sort of situation?
So people I work usually with, and often people I think who have been trying diet after diet, have been struggling with overweight, obesity, emotional eating for long. And usually these are people that have been in this vicious cycle for many years, their whole life or their whole adult life, whatever it is. They usually have a negative self-worth, right? So the self-love, the self-worth, and also with it, the self-care is usually very low. And that's my belief, until you get somewhere to that level where you make yourself your most important person and you develop some sort of self-love, it's very difficult to get over this, right? Because you will obviously have a negative view of yourself, right? This whole, like you said, the body positivity is probably not there. Now, there are several ways of getting there, and usually that takes time. It's not something like you switch on. It's practice, practice, practice. And again, that's something I think needs some coaching work or therapy work, but it's really by starting again, becoming aware of those negative words you're using. Oh, I'm ugly, or look how fat I'm looking, or depending on whatever is in somebody's own mind, right? Again, the subconscious is involved in there, becoming just aware and then starting to transform that into a positive thing instead of looking only at the negative parts. Nobody is perfect. We all have parts on our body that are nicer and others maybe not so nice in our own view. So you can start focusing maybe, I don't know, you have maybe a beautiful nose or beautiful eyes or whatever it is. So rather focusing on So those parts that are positive, that you like about yourself, and bring that in. So if you say, oh, I'm looking fat, or I will never get there, or whatever it is, maybe I'm not yet there. I like really my eyes, instead of only focusing on the negative part. The other thing is, and I think you were, if I got that, this fake it till you make it kind of idea here. And a lot of people believe that. And I don't like the fake you till you make it part, but what I like is to visualize yourself in the future and act as if you were already in the future. So what I do with my clients, and it really works well, is to, first of all, visualize yourself, the future goals you have, your future life, and so on. Really feel it. You can do it with a meditation or write about it or so. And then really go in there and act as if you were already that person. So what would that person think? What would that person eat or not eat? How would they show up for themselves? So slowly you can really reframe your mind into your future self, right? And acting and thinking as that person you want to become. And as such, develop this more positive mindset about yourself, about your life, about your body, and so on.
Who are emotional eaters? Is there a sort of demographic? Does it affect women more than men? Most people would associate women tend to be more emotional than men. I know that's a stereotype, but do you see, who are most of your clients? Are they women of a certain age, men of a certain age? Is there a mix? Where do you see that?
I personally work mostly with women in the realm of around 35 to 60 years, 55, 60 years or so in general, right? I have a couple of clients that are under that, a little bit over, and I work also with some men. But it's just that mostly it just happens. There are, I would say, women are eating more emotionally, but there are many men out there as well. And I think because men will hide more behind with that, women, I think, are more showing it than men in general. There is, I would say, a lot of men that are not aware that they are emotional eaters. But at the moment, I'm working with one. Very clearly, he recognized he's an emotional eater, and we're working on that, and he's doing really great. So having said that, however, I think it's very important to realize for many parents looking at their children to start seeing the signs of emotional eating. And I think that's very important because they are, in fact, the hidden emotional eaters, right? I don't think there are the statistics available to know when is a child emotionally eating and when not. And I think the numbers are far bigger than we would know.
What would some of those signs be if someone has, because their parents obviously listening to this, what would you look for in a 7-year-old kid or a teenage kid? What would be the clues?
First of all, and that might not be a popular opinion, I would look at yourself as a parent. If you show emotional eating tendencies or unhealthy eating habits, probably that's the first sign, right? Because your kid is most likely picking up on that. So it might be not what you want to hear. In terms of looking at your children, I think at schools, there's enormous peer pressure. So already seeing maybe that your child comes home and is not happy about any peer pressure at school, feels bullied or something, might be a sign. I would look definitely at it. Obviously, any overweight is probably the first one. I should probably have mentioned that the first. You would definitely look at overweight as a first part. No child is born overweight per se, right? Yes, of course, there are children who are thinner or thicker or have more fat, less fat, a different structure when they're born. But it's per se not when you're born than that. But children in families where certain eating patterns happen is definitely something. So if your child is overweight, it is probably because of emotional eating and because of eating habits they are learning at home. The other thing I definitely would look out for is hidden eating. When, for example, food is missing or even money is missing and you have the impression that food is bought. And that depends a little bit now where you live and the age of your child or so, if that's possible. But when you have the impression that maybe the child is eating food behind doors or hides food, or you find food under the bed or something like that, that could be a sign. You also want obviously to look out for any signs of maybe even purging or binge eating or something like that. So there are all things that could happen that can lead to emotional eating. I would be always rather cautious about that and definitely seek professional help at the slightest doubt, to just make yourself clever about what are the signs and how can you help your child.
Why do we eat to soothe our emotions? And certain things, no one is probably gorging down broccoli to make them feel better, or I don't know if it's probably not steak either. It seems to be high energy foods, sugary foods, maybe sugar, fat, processed food. What's going on physiologically? Why is that what we use to soothe ourselves? If it's truly an emotional, I don't even know if it's soothing, but maybe you can help me find a better word. But why are people emotionally eating carrots and broccoli and steaks? I mean, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a great question. And by the way, sorry for maybe saying this, but there are people who are eating a lot of broccoli or steak or whatever it might be. There are the exception, but it exists. In terms of eating the unhealthy foods, the sugary food, the high carbs food or so. So what happens is really that our brain gets a certain kick. So we have our dopamine levels, our serotonin levels, and when we eat those sugary high carb foods, together we get basically those neurotransmitters get fed by those foods. So usually what happens then, first of all, one would get the dopamine kick out of them. That's why so many people go back to food. That's why so many food producers add sugar in it, because the sugar creates the dopamine and hence creates an addictive behavior as a result of it. And as probably most people know here, is sugar is highly addictive, right? It's one of the worst drugs, even more addictive than cocaine or heroin or so. So we get that dopamine kick that happens there. The serotonin levels can change as well at that moment. Our whole hormone obviously are getting activated with that. Mostly is the blood sugar, right? And that's why very often we get this high in our blood sugar that goes up when we eat those foods. And the problem is that then after the blood sugar crashes down and we crave more food, so we will eat more, and then we go up again and down. And that is a very unhealthy pattern in so many ways. But obviously that leads to all this vicious circle of craving food eating. And really from there, it's very difficult to get out of. That's why so many people struggle.
Do we see any typical comorbidities that run with emotional eating type things, like alcohol, smoking, any other mental health illnesses? Are there often comorbidities that run with this?
They can exist. First of all, sugar very often is what they call the gateway drug. When you speak with people who have an alcohol or drug addiction, and very often when people have an alcohol or drug addiction or even some other addictions, they maybe overcome that addiction, but then they fall back to a sugar addiction unless they have really dealt with their issues, which obviously is very difficult. And then they continue staying addicted to sugar. So basically they replaced whatever they were addicted to just with another addiction. So that's why it's very important to really work on the root cause there. And one is, many say, the abstinence, but it's very difficult because you cannot abstain from food, right? You have to eat something. So again, we go back to rewiring your mindset, making it easier with certain type of foods until you are able actually to abstain from that. Because in the end, if you have these issues, continuing eating sugar is obviously not the answer.
When you say sugar, would it be more fair to say sweet tasting food? Because there's people that maybe don't eat sugar, but they just continuously engage in artificially sweetened foods. And it may be sugary or sweet tasting foods rather than sugar. Is that a more fair statement, or is it actually the sucrose table sugar molecule itself?
Maybe I should have said earlier, sometimes I interchange those words. When I see sugar and glucose or carbohydrates is basically the carbohydrates we eat in our food, such as, for example, bread, refined carbohydrates like pasta, pizza, etc., etc. These are seen by our body as glucose, and it is treated as such. And that's why it is so dangerous. And hence, it's really important to not overdo this and be aware of that, right? Because otherwise you stay into that. Now, I want to jump just to so that's the one part. And the other part is, you mentioned artificial sweeteners. Now, often people try saying, okay, now I cut out the sugar, and instead of my normal Coca-Cola or soda, sugary soda, I use artificially sweetened soda, which actually is worse. If there's such a thing as worse. The problem is, one, you give your taste buds and also your neurotransmitter a little taste of sugar, and you still continue craving more. Plus, there is a lot of other side effects of those artificial sweeteners that's why I would not recommend them. So there are too many side effects or health issues that you can have if you consume those instead of sugar. Not that I say you should have sugar, it just changes the issues, but you still have the issues.
Okay, fair enough. There's a question in here I want to just address, because earlier you mentioned talking about a positive, like imagining yourself in the future, and this particular person saying their whole life they've been morbidly obese and they can't imagine, they don't have a frame of reference to it. Like some people will say, go back to when you were a teenage kid and you were fit and what you were doing then, but if they've never experienced that, how do they deal with that? Do they imagine there's someone else, or what do they do?
Great question. Love that, John. There are several ways of doing that. And it's quite funny because I've done a meditation this morning about values, very similar to actually what I would recommend to clients or people asking this is, you can either imagine yourself, yes, at the best time of your life. Maybe you want to go back to before you got pregnant or when you were a younger person. So that could be one way. Another way would be that you imagine somebody who you're looking up to. So that could be maybe a family member, maybe your grandmother, maybe a public person, maybe a friend or somebody at work, where you say, oh, I wish I would be like them. And now, don't get me wrong, we don't want to be like somebody else, but we want to embrace those qualities they have. That could be the values, that could be a certain way how they show up every day, that could be a certain way they eat or how they look or whatever it is. Take those qualities, and it can be a mixture of people, of course, but take the qualities of those people that you admire and kind of piece your ideal persona together and call that your future self. Obviously, unless you come up with your own ideas, but that could definitely help. And then try to imagine, how does this person think? How do they eat? How do they react? How do they show up every day? What would they do if they are at a buffet, at a party? What would they do when they're standing in front of the fridge, right? How would they react? Would they take all the pizza and stuff themselves full, or would they maybe rather choose a carrot, right, instead of that, or a piece of meat, or whatever it is?
Do you feel that emotional eating can be cured, or is this a lifetime issue that you're just like an alcoholic type of thing? What are your thoughts on that?
So I cannot use the word cured, or I don't want to like using it, but it's a good question in it. Believe people, like with alcohol addiction, if they have a food addiction, it will always be there. it can be treated like an illness, like a condition. It is always there, right? You need always to be aware. So just saying, oh, I've cured, I've overcome this. No, you will have always to be careful about it. But it can definitely be made much easier, and through working on the mindset, through working on the root causes, through implementing really simple, easy habits that you can do, like brushing your teeth, you are quite safe. The important part there is when you do all these things, you're safe 99% of the time if you do the work, right? I mean, you have obviously to do the work and go really deeper. But if you are, for example, having a hectic time, suddenly you have a stress situation, you have a trauma, maybe somebody dies in your family, you lose your job, whatever, right? That is the 1% where probably you will need to have some plan B ideas in place. And I really like to work with my clients on that, where I say, okay, now you are doing really great. So when I start working with them, we normally start working in their day-to-day life. They're doing really great. They lose their weight. They implement super healthy habits and so on. And then they go on a vacation trip or on a trip, whatever it is. And suddenly everything changes. And that's where I'm working with them. And it's often an ongoing work of practice, until they are able, even in those different situations, or even when some stress hits the fan or so, that they can still stick to their plan. But you will always have to be aware and always have a plan that you can work.
Yeah, I like the idea of having plans. I consider failure to plan as planning to fail. I often use that sort of
huge on that.
People, but what about, are there sort of prodromal type, like there's things that, like when somebody has an epileptic seizure, sometimes there's this prodromal symptoms where they know something's coming. And are there, like, there's going to be a stressful event, then there's going to be a period of time, and then there's the binging behavior or the eating behavior that's sometimes unhelpful. Is there something you can do to intervene in between, and perhaps there's better alternatives? Like for me, I feel wonderful when I exercise. That's why I like to exercise every day. To me, it's stress relieving. There's so many, I always feel good. And maybe that, if I didn't do that, perhaps I would treat it with food, perhaps. But is there a predictable pattern of this happens and this happens and this happens, and it ultimately ends up with you face down in a big giant bowl of ice cream or something like that? Any sort of thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we spoke just about planning. Planning is the most important part here, or one of the most important parts. I fully agree, and you definitely are right on that one. So when you have a plan, and let's say, for example, when you have done meal planning and your food is ready in the fridge, and let's assume it's healthy food, right? It's all ready, and you plan your snacks, or if you're on a trip, you plan your trip and where you will eat, or when you go to a restaurant, you checked out the menu on the website before you go there. You even wrote down what you're eating. That helps you to prevent. Prevention is always better than curing, right? It's always better to anticipate it as much as you can. Obviously, you cannot 100% do that. So try always to plan in advance and prevent it. For example, if you go to an event or something where you know, okay, there's food, you have no clue what's there. Rather have some food before at home, so you already ate something. Like you mentioned, Shawn, you are exercising because you feel good. And I agree. I love exercise too, and obviously do it daily. And I love my walks. It makes me feel good, and so on. So again, do something regularly in form of prevention that makes you feel good. Sleep. Again, going back to sleep, make sure you slept enough. All these kind of things are helpful. Now, you will find, if you are an emotional eater, most people, quite honestly, have sometimes emotional eating moments. I do it too, right? Very seldom, but it can happen. What you can do is, I really like to stop and pause. You can think of your future self, or you can literally just take a couple of breaths. Let's say you realize after you observed yourself a little bit that usually you emotional eat, or you have some cravings when your boss calls. So when your boss calls, just take some time after the call and just take 3-4 deep breaths in and out, focus on these breaths, and then consider, do I still want to emotionally eat? Do I still have these cravings, or is it maybe just something that came into my mind? Or maybe you want to go on a walk, or you want to call a friend because you feel really like upset about the situation. So instead of heading to your fridge and grabbing the ice cream or so, just call a friend. So try to find things that are not food involving, that are something that can help you to feel good in that moment. Maybe try to find a purpose, like bring up a hobby or so. So when you're feeling down, you can just take like a pen and paper and just draw, whatever it is, but something you feel good about.
Are there any particular dietary patterns that either lend themselves more to food addiction or lend themselves to less emotional eating, maybe low carb versus high carb, plant-based versus more animal-based? Do you see any consistent patterns on who might be more likely to resolve emotional eating using a particular dietary strategy?
So those on a high carb diet are usually those who high carb and high unhealthy fats, right? Like trans fats, saturated fat. They are usually more on having emotional eating issues, craving issues, and often weight issues. Because as I mentioned earlier, we discussed a lot during it. It affects your hormones. It affects a lot your blood sugar, your neurotransmitters, and also, of course, liver, your digestion, and so on. So they are definitely, in my opinion, those who are more prone. Those people also who eat a highly refined and highly processed cuisine. So food that's very processed as well, because these are usually there's obviously a lot of sugar, salt, sodium, and so on in it, but also there are a lot of empty calories. And when you eat empty calories, the body can actually even not absorb it, and you damage your gut, that leads to all kind of digestive issues that can affect your neurotransmitters, your hormones, your whole different organs, and so on. You from there are more likely to develop emotional eating. It's literally a chain reaction, a domino effect. It then will affect your mood. So you can potentially become more depressed, anxious, and that will lead then obviously to more emotional eating. So you get into this vicious cycle. Those who usually struggle less with emotional eating are those, and that is what I recommend. Most of my clients are eating too many carbs. So I would recommend those to include far more protein into their diet, cut the carbs very low. So I recommend a low carb diet. I do recommend fiber to include as well. Fiber is important for your digestive health. If you are on a strict carnivore diet, you can obviously maybe adapt it a little bit, but fiber is important for digestive health. That will work as well with your neurotransmitters. And healthy fat is also something that's super important that I would recommend to include in your diet as well. That can, one, help absorb nutrients and absorb the micronutrients as well, which are important, because in the end, very often the body craves nutrients, but your brain understands that it craves food or that it's hungry. And that is something that I find very interesting, that sometimes people, for whatever reason, they might even eat not too unhealthy, right? But for some reason, the body cannot absorb those nutrients, or maybe it's a nutrient poor food they're eating. And then the body just will say, the signal in the brain will say, oh, I need more food. But the only thing they would need more is actually nutrients. And that can lead to more eating and obviously emotional eating as well.
Yeah, the signal for needing nutrition is very old. It would be something that humans have had since the dawn of time, basically. And the problem is the foods that we now have available to us would have not been available before, so we now may consume these foods that don't provide the nutrition that food that might have been available thousands of years ago perhaps do. Is there any, because some people will say emotional eating is food addiction is all a made-up thing. How much science is there around that? If I wanted to look up emotional eating, randomized control trial or something like that, do we have enough data in the scientific literature to support this as a true, actual thing? Because there's a lot of people say this is all just woo-woo stuff and it's all BS and it
Yes.
doesn't exist. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, I will not go down and quote plenty of studies. There are plenty out there. I can tell you that there are human studies, there are studies done with mice and so on. So I personally believe, yes, there is definitely something like emotional eating. There is something like food addiction or sugar addiction, food addiction, both. Like there is alcohol addiction, like there is drug addiction. It all goes under the same umbrella. They're obviously slightly different depending on some people have a certain type of emotional eating, a certain type of food addiction. So definitely there are plenty to answer the question. There are plenty of studies, but one has to be careful as well. I always find it interesting, all these studies out there. It should be really serious peer-reviewed studies that you're looking at, but there are plenty.
Yeah, I certainly believe that there are people that are addicted to food. In fact, I think a recent paper came out suggesting that something about 14% of the population, which is very similar to what we see with regard to incidence or prevalence of alcoholism. So that's one in seven people might be struggling with food addiction. Would that match your sort of estimate? It's hard to say. Obviously, you see the people that have it, and you don't necessarily deal with the people that don't.
Yeah, look, I would not know exactly the numbers on that because it all depends literally on the study. I find that always interesting, but I just would say one thing, Shawn. Studies aside, there are studies, yes, but if you look at just the American population, how many people are obese, how many people have issues like diabetes related to eating unhealthy foods and being overweight, having an unhealthy lifestyle and so on. It's just, if you look at it, and these statistics are getting worse every year and have, like you mentioned earlier, in the olden days, right? It just didn't exist or very little. When we were hunters and gatherers, right? We were not having issues with obesity, with probably very little diabetes. We had not that I know of any emotional eating issues or very little at the time, right? So it's definitely today that I think just practice speaks besides the studies that have been done. I mean, there are numerous studies.
Does emotional eating mostly run with obesity? Is this something that's purely a phenomenon of, say, westernized societies where malnutrition in the form of obesity occurs, whereas you go to a country where they're struggling to get enough food in general? Or do we see it universally across? Or is it just mostly a phenomenon of this westernized diet where obesity is so heavily associated with it?
Mostly, yes. But I just want to say one thing. Not everybody who is overweight is an emotional eater. And not everybody who is an emotional eater is overweight, right, as well. So I just want to say that there is anorexia or bulimia. These are all things. They are they fall under a different, the eating disorders, like emotional eating is a eating disorder. So they're different. There's obviously very often an overlap here and there, but it could be somebody who purges. They are super thin, but they are an emotional eater. They binge and then they just purge, but they might not be overweight. So there are various forms of emotional eating that doesn't show only up that people are overweight. In terms of other countries, look, I lived in plenty of countries. And including African countries. Yes, somebody who doesn't have the money and the means to live how the Western world lives in general is less likely to become an emotional eater. But it does exist as well, not in the same amounts and terms. But for example, let's say in South Africa, I can tell you there are a lot of overweight people, and many of them do overeat emotionally as well.
Do you, as far as, I'm seeing we're running close on time, so I should probably allow you this. Where, if somebody wanted to address this with you in particular, because you said you're digitally based, how do they find you? Who do you typically see as your clients? Oh, there is one question before we go to that I did think of. Is emotional eating, is it almost always rooted in childhood, or can it develop later in life, say it's secondary to a traumatic event, or is it mostly something that kind of starts early on, and is that where you see it?
It can also start later on. In general, however, I really found often there are little things that point in a childhood that wasn't a traumatic event, right? I work with many people who had a traumatic event during their childhood. Maybe they've been abused or raped or something happened. They lost maybe a parent or somebody, whatever it is, but not all. It's probably 40%, 30 to 40% of my clients had really a traumatic childhood, but the other 60 or so percent didn't have. But it can be those small things, because in the end, it can often be just this little belief. And we all have beliefs. We all have beliefs from our childhood, right? Some more, some less damaging maybe, or negative. But it is what we make out of these beliefs, obviously, that forms our adulthood and how we show up in our adulthood and eventually develop issues such as emotional eating. It can be just small little things, like the little thing is a child, for example, sits in front of TV and the parents come home and they put a bag of chips there, and the child eats the chips and thinks, oh, my parents don't love me. The only thing, the parents are really good parents, but they were just tired, right? They have worked the whole day and just needed a break, maybe prepare dinner or whatever it is, right? And the child thought, oh, my parents don't love me. The child is not aware of that, obviously. And it can be that this has been going on years and years and years. And then maybe later in they're 30 years old or whatever, and maybe they have a partner that doesn't show up the way they want. And then they go to the bag of chips and feel the love that comes from the bag of chips. And yes, there was nothing big in their childhood, but that triggered during the adulthood, and there were maybe the seeds set. So often I find that is actually the case. So I usually would look at the earliest event that happened during childhood, just to bring them back to that, to solve that. But it's not always the case. Sometimes it's literally that a trauma during adulthood can bring that up as well.
All right. Thank you very much. And again, where do they find you if somebody wanted to address some emotional eating issues?
Great. I definitely am all over the internet. You can find me on the main social media channels like Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and so on. Usually my handle is Wellness Methods, and wellnessmethods.com is also my website, and there people can find out more. I have lots of free stuff on there, and of course there are also my programs. I will have my group coaching, my one-on-one. I have various other programs as well, and they can even sign up for a little session with me, and I can help find out more about them and then how to help them best.
All right, so wellness programs on Instagram, Facebook, and whatnot.
Wellness methods. Wellness methods.
Wellness methods. Sorry.
Yes.
Wellness methods and wellnessmethods.com. Andrea, it's been fascinating and enlightening. Thank you very much for doing this. Appreciate it. Look forward to seeing how things progress with you. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Shawn, for having me, and thank you for everybody. And I'm here to answer any other questions. Thanks.